George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
Le Petit Roi. Yes, Emmanuel Macron has refused to accept the results of the French general election last Sunday and has asked his own government to stay on. Nobody won the election, he said. Maybe, little king, but somebody lost it, and it was you. There'll be trouble along in a minute in France, and we all know what that looks like. Maybe Joe Biden will try the same trick after the November presidential elections, if indeed that emperor with no clothes ever gets there. Even GeorgeClooney has now seen through him, after giving him several $1 million and telling us he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the BBC Sports Department cannot hide its enmity, hatred, contempt for Djokovic, the Serbian tennis champion, as he progresses through Wimbledon like a knife through butter. They just hate him because he's a Russian. Well, I mean, I know he's not a Russian, but he's a Serbian, and that's the next best thing. And the entire British and European and other military ghouls have arrived in Washington, D.C. for the Warmongers Alliance, otherwise known as Nato. And they're showering money, weapons, and green lights all over the place. World War III, anyone? Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night because it's the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway. The mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
It's official. The Hannibal Directive massacred Israeli citizens. We don't know the number, but it must have been a very significant one. The Hannibal Directive, coined by Benjamin Netanyahu himself, it is now officially acknowledged, was the reason for many of the dead people who died on October the 7th, which was then blamed on the Palestinians. And the rest is history, and what a history it is indeed. We knew this for a long time. We said it for a long time. I said it in my encounter with Piers Morgan, and he looked at me as if I was a man recently arrived from Mars, and that he could not possibly understand even what I was saying. It's been in the Hebrew press for weeks, if not months. But it's now in the English language edition of the prestigious Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and officially sourced within the government. This is significant not because October 7th didn't happen, not even necessarily because it happened with the Israeli complicity, although it's increasingly likely that complicity to a point was undeniable. It's not to say that there were no entirely unjustifiable actions taken by the Palestinian resistance groups that broke out of the concentration camp on October the 7th. But it is to say that we have been sleepwalked through the last 9 months on a gigantic lie. The clue was in the roofs of the cars in the car park at the Nova Music Festival. All of them had been savagely assailed from the air, and the Palestinian factions had no aircraft. The clue was in the kibbutz houses, clearly destroyed by tank fire, by shells of far greater ordnance than the handheld AK-47s in the hands of the Palestinian resistance factions. The clue was in the number of motor vehicles headed for Gaza with hostages inside them that were attacked from the air and eliminated, on the principle, according to the Hannibal Directive, that no hostage must arrive in Gaza, that no hostage must be allowed to arrive in Gaza, and that any vehicles carrying hostages must be destroyed. That is the Hannibal Directive, and it is now clear from Haaretz's groundbreaking journalism that it was indeed the order of battle of the Israeli forces on the day. That means, Piers Morgan, it wasn't even remotely the largest loss of life in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, even if the Palestinians had done all that killing, but they did not. It's now clear that hundreds, perhaps many hundreds, of Israelis were killed by other Israelis. And it just goes to show that you cannot hide the truth forever. You can keep it in the foreign language press. You can refuse to acknowledge when it breaks into the English language press, as this Haaretz journalism has been completely unacknowledged. There are people in Parliament still chuntering about 1,400 Israelis massacred by Palestinian guerrillas on October the 7th, even though they must now know that many hundreds of those, how many hundreds, we cannot yet know, but we will know, although they buried the cars. Do you remember that? That might have been a clue. They actually interred the cars that they destroyed. They buried the bodies, but eventually someone will succeed in court in disinterring their relatives, and then it will be clear exactly who did what to whom. But the killing in Gaza can now not be gainsaid. According to The Lancet, the world's most prestigious medical journal, not a Hamas journal, not a Workers' Party manifesto, The Lancet. If you can't trust The Lancet, who on earth can you trust? The journal of the British Medical Association states in its new edition that 186,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and an uncountable number more have been mutilated and maimed. Gaza is the amputation capital of the world. 10 children are amputated every single day in Gaza, oftentimes without anesthetic, all the time without proper hospital treatment. But 186,000 dead is 8% of the Gaza population, meaning that what we were calling a genocide is now officially becoming a Holocaust. Not the Holocaust. On terms of quantum, nothing, one praise, will ever match the Holocaust of European fascism, of the Nazi annihilation of 6 million Jews and millions of others, but a Holocaust nonetheless. If you kill 8% of the population of a territory, then do the maths. Imagine killing 8% of the United States of America in 9 months, in fire and shot and shell. Imagine killing 8% of the United Kingdom, of France, or any of the countries where the audience tonight is watching from. I invite you, do the maths. And then you begin to see the gargantuan scale of this war crime, this crime against humanity, that the world has not just allowed to happen, not just armed Israel to make it happen, not just funded Israel to pay for it happening, but lied and lied and lied by omission and commission about what happened the day before October 7 and every day back to 1948 and indeed back to 1917. But the hue and cry which accompanied a rocket hitting a children's hospital in Kiev just on the eve of the NATO summit was greeted 2 nights in a row with top story status on the BBC. So far as we can see, 2 people died in that children's hospital in Kiev. So far as we can see, it wasn't even a Russian missile, but a misfiring Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile that hit the hospital. Which doesn't mean it wasn't connected to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. This war, which should never, need never have started, is responsible directly and indirectly for every person that has lost their life or their limb in the course of this last 2 years. But it just goes to show 2 things. First of all, even when all experts say it was a Ukrainian missile that misfired, they'll still call it a Russian missile. And even though every single hospital in Gaza has been reduced to rubble, its doctors, nurses, technicians, and patients have been murdered in their beds, murdered at close quarters. Not a single person has called it a war crime or for Netanyahu to be put on trial for committing it. But GordonBrown, you remember him? GordonBrown, the man that sold Britain's gold reserves at the bottom of the market, was right out the traps this morning saying that Putin should be on trial for the war crime of hitting a children's hospital that he almost certainly didn't hit, which killed 2 people. But the same GordonBrown has never said Jack SH1T about the 36 hospitals and the thousands of people murdered and mutilated therein. Not one single word. These hypocrites who rule us are typified by the Le Petit Roi, little spring-heeled, elevator-heeled Macron, the would-be emperor of France, has just told the French people that his government is going to continue governing their country, even though they came last in the elections on Sunday. His prime minister is going to carry on. My friend Mélenchon has been told he will never be the prime minister. This is, as Mélenchon just said, unique in the so-called democratic world, where a president comes last, where a socialist comes first, where a right-wing nationalist comes second, orders his prime minister to continue in office. Now, the British people might accept that. The Americans might accept it. Most countries might accept it, but the French will never, ever accept it. Mind you, Macron said all this from Washington. Perhaps he took inspiration from the continued efforts of the naked Emperor Joe Biden to pretend that everything in the Rose Garden is, well, rosy, to pretend that he's still the Democratic Party nominee, even though all the major power brokers, all the big funders are telling him it's time to go, Joe. Hey, Joe, where are you going with that ballot in your hand? Your history, you are bound for endless debates with the nurses in a sanatorium. I wonder if Dr. Jill Biden will visit you when you are incarcerated there. That thought just occurred to me. But one thing's for sure, Joe ain't going quietly. He's not going coherently. He grabbed a mic off a union official today and made a statement, even by his standards, that was entirely berserk. If it had been a scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you would not at all have thought it exaggerated. Joe claims he was the first black woman president and served under the first black president and was the first black woman vice president and was talking to Stoltenberg's wife. I think he said talking to, although if I'd been Stoltenberg, I'd have wanted to check with my wife after what Joe Biden said on stage, welcoming the NATO leaders, the greatest warmongers on the history of the planet since the axis of Mussolini, Tojo, and Hitler strode the stage. There they were. Little Zelensky was there, still in that military vest of his. Must be smelling mightily by now. Little Zelensky was there because every time he goes to the United States, he leaves with $60 billion in his back pocket. And his cocaine dealer is mighty happy when he sees Zelensky on the stage in Washington. But it wasn't just money he was picking up today. The mighty Netherlands. They've now lost Mark Rutte. He's the new head of NATO. But the mighty defense minister of the mighty Netherlands announced today a huge subvention of F-16 missiles with which NATO, one by one, are now saying it is entirely permissible to strike inside Russia. The new Labour government in Britain have to get used to saying that. It was not to be outdone. A little indistinguished, inky-fingered clerk of a man called JohnHealy, former Treasury Minister, unprepossessing 2AT, went all the way to Odessa. I wonder if he knew the history of Odessa. I wonder if he knew how many Jews had been slaughtered in Odessa by the Bandera Ukrainian nationalists with whom he's now waltzing and dancing and financing. I wonder if little JohnHealy had ever heard of Odessa and its history before. But he went there and he pledged still more money and still more weapons from the straitened British Treasury, where, to quote the Chancellor of the Exchequer, RachelReeves, there's not a lot of money around. Well, there's not a lot of money around if you are a family with more than 2 children. There's not enough money to reinstate your child benefit, which the Tories cut and put a 2-child cap on. There's not a lot of money around if you're in local government, in councils that are bankrupt, literally bankrupt in the case of Birmingham City Council, about which more later. There's not a lot of money around, you see, when it comes to the National Health Service. God bless its cotton socks. There's not a lot of money around in Britain when it comes to transport, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to child poverty, when it comes to low wages, when it comes to student tuition fees. There's not a lot of money around, as RachelReeves said. But little JohnHealy went to Odessa yesterday and banged more billions of British pounds on the desk for Zelensky's coke dealer, his military industrial complex junkies, hooked on public money, the likes of which has never been seen. Never been seen, the amount of money that's being spent on this conflict. And they didn't just shower money, shower weapons, but they showered a British green light. Keir Starmer told Zelensky he can use long-range British missiles to attack inside Russia. Now, some fools have still not woken up to the incredible danger of this moment. Because I've got to tell you, if I was in the Kremlin, I would treat what Keir Starmer did today as an act of war. And they're lucky that Putin is a much more, how shall I put it, moderate fellow than me. Because if it was me, I would return that act of war with interest. I would make sure that the British people knew that their Prime Minister's escalatory acts were not without cost, and that Russia is not a punch bag. It's not going to be punched around by Keir Starmer. That is for sure. The new Parliament has reassembled. It's not a pretty sight. The grotesque nature of the British electoral system has produced more than 400 Labour MPs. 65% of all the seats in Parliament have gone to a party that obtained just 1/3 of the vote. And if you take out the very large number of people, record number of people, the highest number of people since 1885 who didn't vote at all, then only 20% of the British people voted for Keir Starmer to be the Prime Minister. And yet, in what will become a rubber stamp assembly, he now has the power not just to break Britain, but to take Britain into World War III. I told you before the election that within 6 months of Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister, Britain will be at war. The first shots of that war were fired by Starmer in Washington today. Fasten your seatbelts. It's the mother of all talk shows. As the green smoke rose, their faces flashed out pallid green and faded again as it vanished. Then slowly the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Suddenly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out after it. Forthwith, flashes of actual flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Now, despite everything, the Russians are still ready to do a deal with Ukraine, a peace deal. Question is, will NATO allow Ukraine to do so? They didn't before. Perhaps they ought, now that the military situation at the front is so calamitous for Zelensky that soon there will be no deal worth doing at all. So we're asking the question in the poll tonight, will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal? Yes or no. You can vote on my Telegram, t.me/George Galloway, on my Twitter, my X, on the YouTube community poll, and on the YouTube stream. If you're watching on the YouTube stream, and ditto on other streams that allow you to do so, please share the content that you are watching right now. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It crossed an important Rubicon today, but that only means I've got my eyes on the next important Rubicon. 25,586 of you have already voted. It's pretty overwhelming, but the quantum is also important. Will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal? Yes or no? Now, if you want to call the show, it's toll-free in the US and Canada, +1 844 944 3344, and it's free of charge in the United Kingdom and Ireland. 0808 196 5522. That's 0808 196 5522. The worldwide number is 44203 966 2625. And a big welcome if you are listening rather than watching on radio on KPFK 90.7 FM across Los Angeles and Southern California. Hekmat Aboukhater is a Syrian-American contributor to The Grey Zone and Mint Press, two of the best media houses anywhere in the world. He's also the host of Conversations with Dissidents, and Hekmat joins me now from the United States. Hekmat, welcome to the show. I just struck me there, Conversations with Dissidents. I suppose that's what we now are, isn't it? We have become dissidents. Now, dissidents used to be a magical word in the West. We loved dissidents when they were dissidents on the other side. Soon we'll be having to put out Samistat literature and live in the forests, but that's just an observation. But you look like wholehearted and full of integrity dissident to me. Thanks for coming on the show. I wanted to ask you first about this Hannibal Directive admission by Haaretz. We knew all this, said all this all along, and yet it has become breaking news, but only if you're in Israel, only if you're an English reader in Israel. Nobody in the West has picked it up. Have you even heard about it in the United States?
Not at all from the mainstream media, and thank you for having me, George. I think at this point in time, being in the United States and the United Kingdom, being a dissident is one of the most honorable places that we can hold. Speaking of the Hannibal Directive, absolutely not. The mainstream media has not uttered a word about it. One of my colleagues, White Reed, just posted on his own Twitter account a publication of any mention of mainstream media from AP News to NYT about Hannibal Directive, zero. And additional to the coverage, no apologies are forthcoming. No apologies from Haaretz, Kenneth Roth, the former head of the Human Rights Watch, who libeled and slandered my editor-in-chief, Max Blumenthal, when he initially broke the news along with Electronic Intifada and other news sites. So no apologies forthcoming, no admissions of fault are forthcoming, especially from Haaretz, who are the supposed liberal voices within Israeli society. That is a crisis that we're living in, is that these people hold this faux position within our Western civilized world, unfortunately.
I mean, the situation in your ancestral part of the world seems to be shifting. The plates are distinctly moving. The list of people who said Assad must go is a very long list. Most of them are no longer in office. But one who is in office and who not only said Assad must go, did everything he could to make sure Assad would go, namely President Erdogan of Turkey. He now wants to invite Assad to Turkey for a state visit and is ready to kiss and make up. That's pretty big news, isn't it?
Huge news, George, and you hit it on the nail. There's no country/regime that has been more critical in the proxy war that happened in my country, Syria, than Turkey and the regime of Erdogan. Erdogan, from the very beginning, was making such grand statements, announcing that sooner than later he'll be in the Umayyad mosque to come and read the Fatiha in the mosque to celebrate the liberation of Syria from the crooked Bashar al-Assad regime. And now look at how the tables have turned. The number one mover of the proxy war, the leader of the government that opened the doors to the quote unquote jihadi highway and allowed anyone who wanted to come and become a martyr for their crooked understanding of Islam to do so on Syrian grounds, fighting Shias, fighting moderate Sunnis, fighting Christians, fighting Yazidis, and just genociding the minorities in Syria. That person is now changing his tune. And one of the reasons he's changing his tune is harkens back to Israel. Israel is, if you may, it's the petulant child of the United States in the Middle East that requires the United States entirety of its attention, entirety of its diplomatic support, entirety of its military engagements. So the mere fact in Washington within the State Department is that they have little to no time to pay attention to the current status quo in Syria, in the northeast specifically, the Kurdish area, and that status quo where the United States has about 1,000 military personnel safekeeping the Rojava region of northeast Syria that is Kurdish controlled. That status quo is ultimately unacceptable for Erdogan for two reasons. As long as the status quo maintains, the 4 million refugees living within Turkey, the Syrian refugees living within Turkey, cannot return back home to Syria. And the second thing is that you are initially, with maintaining the status quo, you are allowing for a credible autonomous zone in northeast Syria that could one day become a Kurdish autonomous zone. That is something that is entirely unacceptable to the Turkish project, the Neo-Ottoman project that is ultimately racist against Kurds, against any other minority that is not Sunni Turkish.
You mentioned that 4 million. Some of them have been being attacked in Turkey recently, rising bad feeling against them. 4 million is a very large number of refugees to have in your country, any country. Is that one of the issues? And will those 4 million go back to Syria, or will they be on rubber boats heading for England sometime soon?
That is exactly the point, George. So we have 3.6 to 4 million, estimates vary on the number of Syrians in Turkey. And these Syrians who have lived in Turkey, I pity them every day as a Syrian myself because of the treatment that they received from the Turkish government. The Turkish government fundraised to the tunes of billions of dollars off of their name. They received upwards of $10 billion from the European Union, almost $500 million from the United States to quote unquote take care of these Syrian refugees, when in fact, when you ask any of my friends who live in Turkey who had to escape the wars and go to Turkey, they're living on dirt cheap wages because they're cheap labor and they're always under the threat of being deported and exiled from the one country that is currently holding them. So cheap labor that is also now being played with politically. And to your point, I completely agree with you the way you framed this question, George. There are two decisions that capitals like Washington, Paris, and London need to come to terms with. We have an escalating, fast developing situation in Turkey. Turkey is about to normalize. One of the reasons they want to normalize with Syria is to get rid of these 4 million Syrian refugees. Now, we have an option. The State Department in Washington has an option. The Pentagon has an option. Should they go back to an economically empowered Syria that has the boot of economic sanctions lifted off its neck so that these people, when they return, they have jobs, they have something to do, they have maybe a reconstruction project that they can participate in? Or should they get on dinghies, as you just mentioned, get on rubber boats, make their way to Greece, make their way to Germany, make their way to Paris, to France, and make their way ultimately to the United Kingdom and push for more radicalization from the far right in Europe? We saw the election in France. We saw the elections around the European Union. It should be a warning sign. It should be a warning sign that the integration of the refugees is not taking place, and the policies that are sending these waves of immigrants are the main root of this problem. And I'll tell you right now, if there is no economic sanctions easing on Syria, if there's no policy, for example, one of the main policies here is the United States has a military base outside of the northeast, outside of the Kurdish region. That military base is spot on the one highway that connects Iraq and Syria. It's called Al-Tanf base, and it's on the one highway that connects the two regional partners who have been partners in trade for the last hundreds of years between the Iraqi people and the Syrian people. Under all the names that they've ever existed, they've always traded together. But they can't do that because there's a US base that's blocking the path, quite literally blocking the path between those two nations. So one of the ways here, one of the solutions to avoid further radicalization in Europe is remove these barriers on Syria's economy, remove these obstacles for the Syrian people to finally flip the page, start rebuilding their countries, and maybe even welcome these people that have left the country, welcome them back to promising jobs, to a promising life.
I'm presuming, perhaps it's obvious, that President Assad will accept Erdogan's invitation to visit Turkey and to hug and make up. Although he'd be kind of entitled to say, excuse me, after all you did to us, after all you said about me, has President Assad responded yet?
No, actually, George, he actually rejected. He rejected the proposal to meet in Turkey. He doesn't want to go to Istanbul or Adana and give credibility to this invitation. He accepted to meet elsewhere. He accepted to potentially meet in Iraq or meet in Russia. But to your point, I completely agree. If the Syrian government came to the conclusion that Turkey has been the ultimate tumor on the Syrian people for the last 12 years, 13 years. Turkey, again, I recommend anyone watching this to go on YouTube and watch Lindsay Snell's documentary on how Turkey helped ISIS while NATO watched. It's a short documentary on her new channel, Things Aren't Great. I really recommend it, especially in these weeks as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of NATO, which Turkey is the second army within NATO after the United States. Turkey has been, again, opened the borders. There was a clear path. People will fly from Dagestan, from Tunisia, from the United Kingdom. They'd fly to Ataturk International Airport. They would drive over to one of the cities in the north, in the border between Syria and Turkey, like Orfa. And then they'd simply go down with all the equipment that they need, with all the coordinates that they need, and they would be on their way. Good luck, young buck. Go ahead and fight and spread the thought of Daesh and ISIS as long as you can. So I would definitely understand that sentiment, and I think every single true Syrian feels that sentiment. This disgust that we're now going to have to deal with Erdogan, not another government, not the Turkish people, with Erdogan specifically. But that is something that I think ultimately is for the benefit of Syria to move on, to reestablish diplomatic trade routes, and to start rebuilding again. That's the main thing that the Syrian people need to focus on now.
Hekmat Aboukhater, excellent. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure the audience enjoyed listening. Thanks for joining us. Will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal? Yes or no? 26,633 have voted. Let's get it to 30,000 votes. If you're in the US or Canada, toll free, +1 844 944 3344. If you're in the UK or Ireland, free of charge, 0808 196 5522. If you're in the rest of the world, 44 203 966 2625. Quick break. I'll be right back.
There's a group of people in Twitter who are daily posting discussions about Gaza, Lebanon, what's happening, news updates, aid for Gaza, and trying to enlist the help of Jordan and France and any other regional entity that will help get more aid into Gaza and all of Palestine, for everyone who suffers. So I want to request that everyone who is listening to this go to your local council meetings and peacefully request that their representatives at the local levels do this, because it works.
Thanks for the call, Pia, in Uruguay. I'm a free man of the city of San Francisco, awarded to me for my work on Palestine, on the steps of City Hall itself. So it was a particular delight for me that the San Francisco Council voted by 8 votes to 3 to demand a ceasefire. And that decision didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of campaigning to force the local authority representatives to vote.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Now, our podcast, the quintessential mother of all talk shows, shorn of all bells and whistles, just the essence and just the audio, of course, is doing fantastically well across the world. We are in the charts in more than 100 countries worldwide. Get yours. You can scan it on the QR code on your screen right now. Let's go to England, Bristol, where Martin wants to talk about Ukraine. Go ahead, Martin.
Hello, George. First of all, I'd like to say I'm really gutted that you're not in Parliament. And
thank you, sir. I might be back. You never know. I've been back many times before.
Excuse me for slurring, but I've had a stroke, so I've only got 80% brain. So I might sound
brother,
like I'm
take
slurring.
your time.
But, dear sir, you're a patriot like me, and my idea is this, and I'm doing it, and I would very much like your support. We're talking about, I've been asked to do this, a delegation from the counterculture, the underground, everyone from the Travellers to the Hells Angels to Roger Waters to many, many people like you that care about this great and pleasant land. And we're talking about going to delegation to Russia and speaking and saying we're handing over our network to the Russian people. We're not at war with Russian people at all. The establishment is our enemy, and I can't believe Keir Starmer's done this. He's licking Zelensky's ass. He's licking all the bad people, and England, it's a time we stood up, and I believe we can short-circuit this war.
Well, look, I don't think there's any law stopping you from going to Russia. I haven't been myself since the war began, but I am intending to go. Whether the state likes it or not, I intend to go because I'm not at war with Russia either, and I have no intention of going quietly into what would be the ultimate good night of such a war. Just be careful when you're there about anything that you broadcast or write from there, because there may be a possibility of falling foul of these, of course, democratic, freedom-loving laws that see people get their house taken off them for a podcast that they made in the Donbass. I recall vividly a very small family home of a young man, a young Englishman, was literally confiscated by the British government because they didn't like the podcast he made in the Donbass. So just be, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't take my advice as legal advice, but so far as I am aware, it is not unlawful to travel to Russia, although you'll have to go in a roundabout way now because flights have been cut off. You can go from Belgrade, I know, so you could go Heathrow, Belgrade, Moscow, and that's something for you and your friends to discuss. But just be careful about any broadcasting or journalism that you did there, because you could be breaking the law. I know it sounds grotesque, but I feel the need to say that to you. Arkan Anarchist says in 2013, Ukraine signed a memorandum of understanding on joining the Belt and Road. The US could never have broken up and vassalized Europe if it had integrated with Asia. And Mikael Carlson says the war in Ukraine started in 2014 when Ukrainian forces attacked the two breakaway oblasts in the Donbass, an attack that went on for 8 years before the Russians came to their assistance in 2022. The legend, Sarkar, is on the line in Glasgow on the Hannibal Directive. Go ahead, Sarkar.
Evening, George. George, I call as a really angry and sad person, and I'm sure you can understand why. Let's rewind 8 or 9 months back, from the Guardian to the Daily Mail to the Telegraph to the BBC. You can close your eyes, pick any or all of the above options. All of them said that all the massacres were done on October 7th by Hamas, barring few sensible people like yourself, Scott Reiter, and many more. Everybody believed what was told. Not me, few days ago, not me, Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper. It's not a British newspaper, not an Saudi Arabia newspaper. It's an Israeli newspaper who has clearly said that the IDF carried out the Hannibal Directive. That means most of the people from the Israeli side who died were courtesy the Israel forces shooting, massacring them, just, carte blanche. Now, herein lies the question. The aftermath, what happened? Everybody believed that all the people were killed by Hamas. What happened was, now it has been exposed, it was done by the IDF, most of them, and in retaliation, 60,000, 70,000 people have died, hundreds of thousands homeless, crippled, maimed. We don't know what's going on in Gaza. I'll be honest, George, Netanyahu is literally neck deep in corruption. He knows the longer this war goes on, the longer innocent people die. He'll be in office. Joe Biden is happy, Starmer will be happy, Macron will be happy. They keep on funding him. If he goes to jail, this war can stop literally the next day. A president of United States could call him and make him to stop the war the next day. But the man is in corruption. He wants the war to go on. Innocent people getting killed. Why? So he doesn't go to jail. What nonsense is this, George? I'd like to hear your views.
Well, every day, and it's every single day, for all the talk of humanitarian pauses and aid getting in and all the faff that we've been treated to over the last 9 months by our own politicians and by our own media, it is still happening. There is now officially, according to the United Nations, a famine in all of Gaza, a famine on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, a famine 4-hour flying time from London, a famine 1 hour's flying time from the Eastern Mediterranean European countries, a famine when there are navies of all the NATO powers gathered in the Eastern Mediterranean for the forthcoming war should it break out. A famine when there are tens of thousands of trucks lined up along the highway through the Sinai all the way back to the Suez Canal. A famine and people being bombed and shelled and mutilated, maimed and murdered every single day. The famine is the right hand, which will take them all, and the left hand is the world's most fearsome weapons, given gratis by our countries to mutilate children and women. Most of these Western politicians, all of these Western journalists, have switched their phones off. That's the only conclusion you could possibly reach. They can't possibly be on Twitter, can they? Because if they were, they'd be looking at the same corpses, the same mutilations, amputations, the same headless children, legless children, as we are looking at. And if they were looking at it, they couldn't still tell the lies that they do, could they? Thanks for that call. Now, make sure you call in tonight on any of tonight's topics, the Hannibal Directive, Syria, the Ukraine hospital story, or on Gaza, or perhaps you've got an opinion on Keith Starmer's first week in office. Give me a call now. Tell me your point of view. Georgie's favourite says, how will NATO handle an inevitable Trump presidency? Seems likely that they're gearing up for internal conflict. Would love to hear you talk about this. And Christina Hines says, I always try to share MOATS on social media. If people watching MOATS would make the effort to share it, we could continue to break through the problems of uninformed and misinformed voters. Sam is also in England, in Buckinghamshire, and wants to talk about BRICS. Let's hear from him. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Galloway. First of all, many congratulations for all your good work. You help us more than once a week, a number of times a week, reminding us of what we need to be reminded of. Yes, I'm in Buckinghamshire, but I'm originally from the United States. I'm as old as Israel is old, but I spent more than half of my life in England, which I think gives me a bit of a perspective. On the 4th of July, yes, I read the Declaration of Independence. I was struck by a number of factors. First of all, I was reminded how rarely we ever read it. Instead, the 4th of July is just a bunch of flag waving and people telling each other how great America is. The other factor that struck me was that the reading of the content of the Declaration of Independence, be the reading in Washington, D.C., be it in Westminster, be it in Brussels, would be, again, the height of hypocrisy. The content of the Declaration of Independence, I was struck by this, could be read honestly and clearly in the BRICS summit. People, I think, are most familiar with the preamble where it says that it recognizes the fact that all people are created equal and given inalienable rights by our Creator. Well, Washington, D.C., Westminster, Brussels deny our Creator to begin with. And when we see what they are doing in front of our very eyes in Palestine, also in Ukraine, but Ukraine is not as visible. So let's talk about Palestine. They cannot stand in front of us and repeat those words and pretend, even for a moment, to believe that all men are created equal. On the contrary. But what also struck me even more so was the list of grievances which are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, because they are very contemporary. A few of them are very specific to the late 18th century, but others of them are absolutely the same as today. For example, regime change. They're using 18th century, late 18th century vocabulary, but it is regime change. That the king, instead of king, let's read it as hegemon, changes or abolishes the representative governments and establishes his own. Regime change, coup d'etat, economic sanctions. They complain because the king, let us read it as hegemon, has blocked their trade worldwide. Military occupation and brutal military occupation. It moves on, the Declaration of Independence, fabulous document, moves to a conclusion where it says, we therefore, appealing to the Supreme Judge
well,
of the world.
It is indeed a powerful document, if riddled with hypocrisy. All men are created equal, except the slaves that I keep while I'm writing this Declaration of Independence. all men are created equal except my slaves. It is, of course, in part written by the great Tom Paine, the great Englishman of letters, supporter of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, made an important contribution to both, and God bless his memory. It is inspiring words, but it's only words. As you said, those words could not, with a straight face, be read out to people around the world whose independence the United States has done everything, including drowning them in blood, to prevent. Sam, thanks for that call. Terence is in Norwich on dissidents. Go ahead, Ter.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Nice to hear the word dissident. It's ironic slightly, and I think I'm occupying at this moment in time a parallel universe, because I noticed a young boy that won as an independent and gained the vote in Leicester for saying what's happening in Palestine. His supporters are now being charged with nothing less than terrorism for supporting the truth. Mm-hmm. Am I really living in a parallel universe, Mr. Galloway? What say you?
Well, that's why I raised it. Perhaps only people of your age and mine know quite the nuance of the point I was making. Dissidents were once worshipped in the Western media. Soviet dissidents, Czech dissidents, Polish dissidents, Chinese dissidents, they were red carpeted if they ever made it out. Their books were put right to the front of the shelf. Dissidents were the zeitgeist of our younger years, Terence, thee and me. And now we're the dissidents, and they all hate us to the extent that even where we win parliamentary seats, they're looking for ways to criminalize us, looking for ways to disqualify us. Others are being robbed in the elections. But the one thing we've got that they'll never have is the truth. And the truth will always out. The truth of the Hannibal Directive is out now. Doesn't matter that the BBC would rather insult Djokovic than tell us what the most important Israeli newspaper has just broken. It doesn't matter, because nobody's watching the BBC. Nobody's reading these disgusting rags. People who've got the mind to be the change maker in Western countries long ago left this mainstream media long behind. And they're watching shows like this, watching The Grey Zone, watching the Mint Press, watching the conversations with dissidents, with that young man Hekmat. They're letting their fingers do the walking across the keyboard, finding online alternative versions of events to the fiction, the deliberate fiction of Western media narratives. So I've got a spring in my step, Terence, as I hope you can tell. Smokey says it's against the Geneva Convention to use the Hannibal Directive against your own citizens. This is why they are changing the wording of how they employed it. And the Comfort Zone said, hello from a regular listener from Grenada in the Caribbean, which has been impacted by Hurricane Beryl. Well, I'm very sorry to hear about the hurricane's impact. Paradise called Grenada was once hit by a hurricane called Ronald Reagan, when some useful idiots undermined the New Joe movement and the government of Maurice Bishop. But you've definitely got to be done certain age to remember any of that. I've got Aaron Maté coming up after this break. Only a fool would want to miss it. Stay tuned. Thank you. Go ahead.
During your show in the past, you've often mentioned that Donald Trump would be a much better alternative than Biden, although you weren't a big fan of him, etc. And you said that in all likeliness, if he gets in power, he'll be much more appeasing towards Putin. There'll be less likely of the conflict to escalate. But I have to tell you, I'm not so sure about that. Really, I think the only way to solve all this, it doesn't matter if Kenny gets in or anyone else, because there's always going to be, at one stage of our lifetime, two psychotic leaders of the superpowers. Why hasn't anyone in your show or yourself mentioned anything about nuclear disarmament or CND? Surely the only way to save humanity is by nuclear disarmament. And I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, of course, but how are you going to get that? I mean, does CND even still exist? They could have been leafleting outside every cinema showing Oppenheimer. But of course, they don't have enough people to fill a telephone box. It is the worst example I know of, although the Stop the War Coalition runs it close, of an organization that for its sectarian, internal, political reasons has thrown away its brand. I have not appeared on a Stop the War platform for an entire decade. Not to worry, no to NATO, no to war. Its rival organization attracts exponentially larger numbers of people. They cannot help themselves, these people. These members of leftist groupuscles have it in their DNA that they cannot get along with anybody who isn't exactly like them. And as the number of people who are exactly like them is mercifully tiny, they end up in tiny organizations. So, of course, I'm in favor of the destruction of nuclear weapons. But how are you going to get that? It's a totally utopian slogan to advance at this point in time. I'm just trying to stop the weapons from being used.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal, yes or no? Aaron Maté is the journalist at The Grey Zone, co-host of Useful Idiots podcast, and my goodness, there are plenty of useful idiots around. Aaron Maté, one of the top journalists in the world right now, joins us now. Aaron, before we get on to the big stuff and your vindication, I just looked at TheSquad, AOC, saying that Joe Biden has been the best president of her lifetime. What is she, like 13 or something?
You know, every time I think about the progressives we have in the U.S. here, George, I just my heart breaks at what could be if we had leftists, if we had principled anti-war voices like you have in the UK, which of course you being the standard bearer, yourself, Jeremy Corbyn. If we had that kind of integrity in our Congress, it would look a lot differently. Our progressives, our leftists, our anti-war candidates over here, they, on the one hand, accuse Joe Biden of being complicit in genocide, but then turn around and take selfies with him like AOC did, endorse him for president. Even Ilhan Omar, who's taken, some brave stances, especially on Gaza, said that Joe Biden's the best president of her lifetime and that we have his back. She's saying this about a guy who she's also saying is complicit in genocide. So there's no consistency here. There's no principles, really. And that's why these same people, all of them in lockstep, have voted every single time to funnel the Ukraine proxy war, to arm death squads in Ukraine, to continue this disastrous war that sacrificed Ukraine for the goal of bleeding Russia, as its neocon architects have made clear. And yet our progressives here in the U.S. are in lockstep behind it, including also Bernie Sanders. It's really sad.
Sad indeed. But before we leave that territory, George Clooney, I suppose, I don't know how liberal he is, but he kind of looks like the ultimate liberal, the acme of liberalism. He's said that Joe must go. And it seems there is a genuine cleavage between the wealthy backers who've got skin in the game, of course. They've all donated millions. The wealthy backers, the big donors, and one or two others. And it's now only the so-called progressives, leftists, like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, that are sticking with Joe. Who's going to win?
It's a great question. Based on history, money wins. That's what talks and that's what wins. So, you know, if we're going off history, I would bet on the donors. But who knows? Joe Biden, of course, is a very stubborn person. He spent his whole career devoted to one thing, you know, serving his corporate backers, but also, you know, serving U.S. hegemony. And that same rigid worldview is also now leading him to ignore the calls from his own party, his own donors, because he wants the power. He wants to stick around. He wants to keep confronting Putin, who in his mind he thinks he's defeating, even though, of course, he's suffering a huge loss in the Ukraine proxy war. Biden is. So I don't know what is going to happen. It is so funny that the progressives are pretty much the only ones defending Joe Biden, when what has he given them? He's not only presiding over helping Israel commit one of the worst mass murders in history, but he's done very little on the domestic front when it comes to serving progressive causes. I keep hoping these progressives have some secret plan, like maybe they see now Biden's vulnerability with the elite as an opportunity for them, and they're going to try to get, and they're actually going to get something for it. Like, I'd love to be proven wrong, but so many times these progressives will defend the same neoliberals they claim to oppose and get absolutely nothing. So I have no reason to expect anything differently here.
Now, we both gave Piers Morgan a dusting in the ring over recent weeks. It's, I think, to his credit that he does bring people like you and me on a show with a big audience. Something like 10 million people have watched my encounter with him. It's to his credit that he does that. But he is one hell of an ignorant guy. I mean, ignorant as in appearing not to know even the most basic things about which he takes such a grandstanding position. I mean, I grandstand on things that I really know. I wouldn't dream of doing so on something that I didn't know. And you must know whether you know or not. And the Hannibal Directive is a case in point. When I raised it with him, Aaron, he literally looked at me like I was talking in Dutch or Greek, like he didn't even compute the language that I was talking to him about. Now, thanks to Haaretz, we can both say, we told you so.
Yes, we can. And let me say, I thought your appearance on Piers Morgan was a masterclass, and I really recommend anyone who hasn't seen that to go watch it, because that you really did give him a good education on a variety of topics, all the causes you've been involved with your whole life, including, of course, stopping Israel's occupation, apartheid of the Palestinians. And yes, this Hannibal Directive, if you were paying attention to your show, if you were paying attention to The Gray Zone, to Electronic Intifada, to Mondo Weiss, since October, you would have learned that Israel enacted the Hannibal Directive, this operational order that basically says we'd rather kill our own people, we'd rather kill Israelis than let them be taken hostage by Palestinian militants. Not because, on Piers Morgan, I was debating an Israeli settler who said the reason we do that is because we're afraid that if we don't kill them, they're going to be tortured and raped and sexually abused under Palestinian captivity, which, of course, as we've seen from the captives that have been released in Gaza, is false. They've actually been treated pretty well, most of them, although some have alleged some horrific things. But for the most part, if you look at the freed captives, they look pretty well as compared to Palestinian captives, hostages by the thousands who were routinely tortured and abused in Israeli prisons. So that's the official reason. But the real reason is because they don't want to negotiate with Palestinian militants. They don't want to treat them as equals. And Israel doesn't want to have to give up its own captives, the Palestinians that it keeps in its own dungeons and has long before October 7th for years and years and years. Palestinians who are arrested for even the crime of waving the Palestinian flag, which was once criminalized in the occupied West Bank. So that's why Israel is willing to kill its own people to prevent that because it doesn't want to have to treat Palestinians as equal and free them if Israeli soldiers are taken hostage. And so, as has been reported at those websites that I mentioned, and I really have to credit Max Blumenthal here, Ali Abu Nima, David Sheen, Asa Winstanley of the Gray Zone and Electronic Intifada, who have taken the lead on this. And they've shown, based on Israeli sources exclusively, that yes, the Hannibal Directive was enacted on October 7th. The confirmed number of locations in which Hannibal was used inside Israel is at least 7. There's kibbutzes, kibbutzim, there's Israeli military outposts, and there's also now, we learned from Haaretz 9 months later that the area, the southern frontier separating Gaza and Israel, the order there by Israel was to turn that into a killing zone to stop Palestinian militants from bringing over Israeli captives. And also any vehicle also heading into Gaza was also ordered to be fired at. So you have multiple locations where Israel enacted an order to kill its own people to prevent them from being taken captive. And it raises the question, which again, these aforementioned brave journalists have been raising from the start. Did Israel kill the majority of Israeli victims on October 7th? It's a fair question when you're talking about one of the world's most advanced militaries raining down Hellfire missiles from Apache helicopters. And now we learned from Haaretz that they also used artillery, which wasn't known before, according to Max Blumenthal, who's done some of the most outstanding work on this. That's a new detail. The artillery component of this is newly confirmed by Haaretz. So how many people did Israel kill on October 7th? We certainly don't know because Israel has been blocking a credible investigation, but undoubtedly it was a lot, and possibly it was the majority, which means that Israel, which has been constantly claiming that October 7th was the worst day for Jews since October 7th, well, that means Israel is directly complicit in the worst day for Jews since October 7th and was possibly responsible for the majority of casualties.
I mean, if they gave Nobel Prizes to people like us, Max and the other great journalists that you mentioned, and I include yourself in that, it would be awarded for this story because everyone who wrote it, who said it, and those like me who amplified it were called every name possible. Every pejorative was hurled at us, including by Haaretz. Haaretz, above all, owes Max and others an apology, doesn't it?
Haaretz called Max a master manipulator for reporting exactly what Haaretz has now confirmed. They've written several hit pieces about Max, and yet now they've confirmed exactly what they attacked him for saying. It's really incredible. I mean, I talk about chutzpah. But look, it's worth stressing. Even if none of this was true, even if there was no Hannibal Directive, it would still be ridiculous to be talking over and over about October 7th when right before our eyes, every single day since October 7th, there have been unspeakable atrocities committed every single day against Palestinians in Gaza. So even the conversation about October 7th is skewed because it presupposes that Israeli victims have more value than Palestinian victims. And there have been infinitely more Palestinian victims. We don't even know how many Palestinians have been killed throughout Israel's mass murder campaign. The official toll is around 40,000. There was just a letter in the Lancet estimating it's exponentially more than that. Who even knows? But it's in the tens of thousands. And yet the conversation still is about what happened on October 7th. And the reason the conversation has been about October 7th is because Israel and its apologists in the establishment media across NATO states need to keep manufacturing these claims, need to keep the focus on this one day in order to manufacture consent for the atrocities unfolding before our eyes. And now we learn that even their supposed pretext for launching this entire 9-month mass murder campaign is once again based on lies. Previous lies that included the dozens of beheaded babies and burned babies and the Hamas sexual violence scam, which also these same outlets, Gray Zone, Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, have taken the lead in debunking. Now we can add one more confirmed scam, which is the claim that Hamas was responsible for killing all those civilians. Hamas and other Palestinian militants were responsible for killing all those civilians, when you have even Haaretz now, based on Israeli military sources, confirming what was known from the start, which is that Israel killed its own citizens at multiple locations on October 7th. And again, look at the images we saw, all those burned out cars. if you listen to Palestinians from the start, people who follow the Palestinian resistance factions, especially the Al-Qassam brigades very closely, these Palestinian voices said it's very unlikely that Palestinians had the military capability to cause such destruction. This is an occupied people. They're cut off from the rest of the world. Yes, they have some weapons, but not the kind of weapons that can do this kind of damage. So it made perfect sense that, in fact, this sort of destruction was carried out by the Israeli military. And only now, 9 months later, has one of Israel's top media outlets confirmed what was obvious all along.
Is it having any impact on Israeli public opinion, do you think? Would they likely support the idea of killing their own people to stop them becoming prisoners?
That's a great question. Given how much they do not value Palestinian life and how much they thrive on this idea of supremacy and how everything is done to enforce that supremacy. And this goes way back before October 7th. Back in 1967, Ariel Sharon was talking about our main weapon is their fear of us. And he's reflecting the fact that Israel knows it's an occupying power. And the only way it can sustain itself is by inflicting sufficient fear and destruction, carnage in the people it's occupying to get them to bow their heads and not resist. And when they do resist, then that's just intolerable for the occupier. So therefore, it's better, according to Israeli logic, to kill your own people than to let the people living under our boot, under our occupation, to let them get away with taking one of our people so that they can free theirs. And so has that mentality set in across Israeli society? I think, frankly, sadly, it has, because look how many people there are tolerating this unspeakable mass murder campaign for the last 9 months. So unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised that this doesn't cause a big stir inside Israel beyond a small sector, because inside that society, the logic of supremacy has unfortunately really set in.
Just a quick change of direction, and finally, Aaron, some of the worst mass killers in the world are gathered together in Washington, D.C. right now. They are backslapping, celebrating the anniversary of Nato. They're showering weapons and money and green lights on little Zelensky. What do the American people think of it all? Especially when you've got Trump banging the drum that these people are all burning America's money and why don't they pay for their own defense? And the oftentimes suggested or hinted intention of an incoming Trump administration to distance from or even leave NATO, basically shut it down. Is there much public debate, do you think, on this?
There's not, because the American people have been offered very little information and very little political choice. So most Americans don't know, for example, that there was a peace deal tentatively reached very early on in Russia's invasion between Ukraine and Russia. A lot of the key points were settled. According to one top Ukrainian negotiator, he said Putin did everything possible to make peace. But what Americans don't know, not only was there only what they don't know is that not only was there almost a peace deal reached, but that the U.S. and U.K., thanks to a personal visit from the U.K.'s Boris Johnson, blocked that peace deal and sentenced Ukrainians, tens of thousands of them, to death as a result of that decision. So most Americans don't know that there have been reasonable alternatives to war from the start, not just in the early weeks of Russia's invasion, but well before, because people don't know about the Minsk Accords and the 2014 U.S. backed coup. So the Americans lack information, but they also lack political choice, because yes, Donald Trump sometimes talks about, he vows that he'll end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. He talks a big game, but what has he done? What did he do in office? He sent weapons to Ukraine that even Barack Obama wouldn't send. He tore up really important arms control treaties with Russia that made the likelihood of war that much greater, because one of Russia's key demands before it invaded was for the U.S. to address the dangerous arms control climate that had been fueled in part by Trump tearing up these really important treaties. And the Biden administration pretended to be open to discussions, but ultimately told Russia that we're not going to change anything, and we're not going to change our open door policy to Ukraine. And think of this from Ukraine's perspective. The U.S. was willing to risk a war with Russia in Ukraine for the sake of keeping open its open door to Ukraine. Well, what's Ukraine being told right now when it comes to its open door to NATO? Sorry, you're not getting in, because according to Biden, you're too corrupt and you're not ready yet. So basically, what this really underscores, and this was obvious from the start, this is not a new insight. I've been saying this for a long time. The so-called open door for Ukraine into NATO was simply a backdoor for NATO to fight Russia, because by giving Ukraine this future promise of NATO membership that allowed the U.S. and its NATO allies to integrate Ukraine militarily into NATO without taking on the obligation of having to defend it by making it a member. So in the most cynical way possible, Ukraine's being used as a backdoor under the guise of an open door to NATO. And that backdoor has been used to fight Russia. And the cost has been hundreds of thousands of lives, Ukrainian and Russian, Ukraine losing 1/5 of its territory and possibly more. And a lot of profits for the arms manufacturers who are the main beneficiaries of that meeting going on in Washington.
Extraordinary. Aaron Maté, your some turn. Thanks very much for joining us. Aaron Maté of The Grey Zone and the co-host of Useful Idiots. If you're not following him already, you really ought to. He's one of the most outstanding journalists in the world today. Will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal? Yes or no? You've got about, 30 minutes still to vote. Get it up, if you will, over 30,000. Yes or no, will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal? Piltdown Man says Aaron Maté was ambushed on Piers Morgan, but he handled himself well. And Christina Hines says it's frightening that the Labour leader is supporting Britain going to war. Voters don't seem to realise what they voted for. Their sons will soon be forced to go to the front line. Well, let me take a break. I'll be right back. Now, you're used to telephoning questions into me on my various shows. I've spoken with thousands of you over the last couple of decades. But now, on my new show, you get a chance to appear in person on a video wall. It would be good to see what you looked like as well as what you sounded like. It's very simple to get on my show. Go to www.haveitoutwithgalloway.com. Just register there. We'll get you on the television with me. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Do check out my new show, Have It Out with Galloway. My guest on this current edition is Dr. Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Palestinian occupied territories. A simply wonderful woman, magical woman. And I think you'll find that there were some interesting video calls too. Again, many of them seem to hate me, but then the title is Have It Out with Galloway. But if you want to have it out with me in a nice way, you are welcome. Write to www.haveitoutwithgalloway.com. Show goes out on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on my YouTube channel. Let's go to Virginia, where Andrew wants to talk about the Hannibal Directive. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, George. I watched everything that happened on October 7th. At 1 a.m., the war started, and not only was Israel not blocking the Palestinians from coming in, it wasn't blocking all the Arab news channels from showing what was happening. They filmed the whole thing, first off. So there's no argument about what actually happened for the next 6 hours. I call it the Hamas 6-hour war. The numbers that you're looking for are 1,400 were killed, 350 of them were Israeli soldiers. Hamas killed 50 civilians. 200 Hamas were killed, and that left 800 Israeli citizens and foreigners that were butchered.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I just want to leave it at butchered. You know what?
Yeah,
Israel
I thought you were,
did
and that's
was-
why I was insisting that you continue. Butchered by whom, Andrew?
By the girl tank crews. They were ordered to. They questioned the order. They tried not to. The girls did it. Yes, they did it. But they didn't want to. The brigadier general is responsible for it. Netanyahu insisted on it. I told you he was insane. He was driven mad by the death of his brother Yuri at the raid of Entebbe, and he will slaughter everyone just to win, and that is his goal.
Andrew. Thanks. Of course, these figures are not attested. It's a reasonable speculation, but we don't know them for sure. All we know is that it is now official that the Hannibal Directive was responsible for some of the Israeli deaths. And given the power of the Israeli military, the weaponry it deploys, the range of tactical options that it has, from helicopter gunships to heavy artillery and so on, it's highly likely, as Theresa May might put it, that a very significant number of the Israeli casualties were inflicted by their own armed forces. Thanks, Andrew. E. Walker says, waiting for the truth to come out about the October 7th music festival deaths that were blamed on Hamas. Well, according to Haaretz, again, the resistance that broke out of the concentration camp did not know that there was a music festival. Their own plans, according to Haaretz, were to break out of the concentration camp, seize as many Israeli military hostages as they could carry and get them back inside and negotiate the release of their hostages. It was really as simple as that. But the Nova Music Festival was 2 days prior to it happening. So on October 5, was moved to within hearing distance of the concentration camp in Gaza. On the same day, Israel withdrew 3 whole brigades of its soldiers from the border fence, which was why hours went by before any significant Israeli military response took place. Doesn't quite sound like the crack Israeli military response you would imagine. Christine Haynes says people should comment on posts from ITV, BBC, Sky News and Murdoch's newspapers on social media, asking them why they have not reported this Hannibal Directive story. Good point, Christina. Let's go to California. Who wouldn't? Where Orion wants to have a fight with me. Come and have a go, Orion, if you think you're hard enough.
Yeah, George, I love you, but I'm not a pacifist, so don't expect that. The thing is, George, I think you would get more votes if you didn't call Sunak little Richie Sunak, and you didn't call Schultz little Schultz, and you didn't call Richie Sunak a shoeshine boy. A shoeshine boy or man is important as a Detroit worker. I'm a Marxist, so I think that your division of the working class by height is, you might get more votes that way.
Sunak's not really in the working class, Orion? You feel me?
The fact that he might be huh?
You know, Sunak is the richest person ever. He's the richest person ever in British politics. He's a multi-millionaire with many hundreds of millions. and he married a billionaire with several billions. So when I call him a shoeshine boy, I promise you I'm not dividing the working class.
I love it, George. I was a 99-pound weakling, and you tend to be a macho guy, or what we call jock.
I'd already worked out, Orion. You're that guy that used to be in the Charles Atlas newspaper adverts. I was a 6-stone weakling.
Yeah, 99.
Until I signed up for Charles Atlas's course of chest expansion. Go ahead, my friend.
I love you, George, but you know, Jimmy Dore learned not to use sexual terms, and I think you need to not call people short or runts and stuff like that. I mean, how tall are you, George?
Tell me, Orion. Are you a short man yourself?
How tall are you, George? No, I'm 6 foot. And I just saw a great drummer.
You're standing up for the little guy. You're standing up for the little guy.
Yeah,
good for you.
Yeah, I always have been. I'm a Marxist, but I'm an egalitarian. You know, and I'm for the working class, the international working class. Yeah, and I'm for free Gaza and free Palestine. And I'm everything you've done, George. I've
enjoyed knocking you around, kicking sand in your face, and you've been great fun. You've been a great sport. Thanks very much for the call. Hong Luong 3427 says, since Gigi hosted that show, Hiowog, there's less crazies on MOATS. That is interesting. First, I've never seen it called Hiowog before. Have it out with Galloway. Since I hosted that show, there's been less crazies on MOATS. Well, Hong Luong 3427, you might have written that before some recent calls. Wild Woodlands Southwest says, I just subscribed to Useful Idiots. I didn't know where to find Aaron except on the Grey Zone. Cheers. Well done for that. Everyone should subscribe to Useful Idiots. Tony is in Doncaster on the Hannibal Directive. Go ahead, Tone.
Sure. Hiya, George. I'll ask the question. Am I allowed to mention a rival media company if I actually rang them last week and they've denied that Hannibal Directive?
Yes, of course, Tony. Okay. Yes.
All right. I'll ask the
of
question
course.
first. Right. I'll level with you. I've just come home from work last week and I listened to, for all my deficiencies, Talk Radio. As you're well aware of the company, because I listened to it for many, many years and followed you. And I listened to an article that absolutely incensed me, that they said that 1,200 people died at the musical festival. So I rung the gentleman concerned at Talk Radio last week. I informed him of the facts that there for anybody to check, that the figure was probably down to about 350. And out of the 350, the IDF forces on several websites, including Cradle.com, yourself and Max Egan, who's a notorious Australian journalist who's done brilliant work on this with the website The Crow House, that a lot of these people could have been potentially killed by helicopter gunships because of the incendiary heat on the cars that can't be done by machine guns. When I mentioned the words Hannibal Directive last week on the radio, I was shut down, I was ridiculed, I was felt to be embarrassed on the radio, and I actually came off the radio, sat my wife, nearly in tears, to make me feel like an idiot. And I'm so glad, from an emotional point of view, that you've justified that I'm not going around the bend, that this is actually happening. Because when you talk to decent working people in the street that just don't know this, and here's my last point, you started with probably 500,000 listeners and you're now up to millions. I just hope to God that this keeps growing and growing and growing, because the only way that people are going to learn and change, like I've changed as I've got older listening to you, is through education, George.
Well, God bless you, Tony. Not only have you not gone round the bend, you're a very brave man, because it's the brave thing to do, to confront these jokers with the truth. even if they ridicule you, as they've got the bully pulpit they can do, that they will not in the end be able to stop the truth from coming out, and it is now out. It was not you or me that was round the bend, it was them for willfully peddling a pack of lies for the worst possible purpose, namely to justify a genocide against millions of the entrapped inmates of a concentration camp, half of whom are women, half of whom are female. Amazing. These big, tough guys that love the sound and the smell of napalm in the morning, they don't mind if it's burning children. They don't mind if it's burning women, as long as it ain't their children, as long as they ain't their women. Tony, in Doncaster, God strengthen you always to be the courageous man. Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose. Dare to have it known. That was one of the late and great Mr. Tony Benn's favourite adages, and I picked it up when he fell. Sharon Brown says Hamas targeted military installations for the most part, as was pointed out by Richard Medhurst talking about that Haaretz article. And Guni 1972 says Haaretz sounds like a German hair removal shampoo. What's a hair removal shampoo? That'd be a funny kind of shampoo. A hair removal shampoo. Haaretz. H-A''A''R-E-T-Z. Z, not Z. Z. Yasser is in Quebec on the British general election. Well, I told you this was the global university of the airwaves. Yasser, on you go, sir.
Good day, Mr. Galloway. First, I wish to express my sympathies with you, with your family, with your party, and most importantly, with the hopeless, helpless people across the world who've now lost a voice in the parliament. As you can imagine, I'm really sad that you weren't able to win this time around. And in a way, as sickening as it may be, I tend to agree with that sickening headline of The Telegraph. Indeed, it is a triumph for Israel. And I'm sure you know what I mean exactly. The reason I'm calling...
but they can win a battle. I don't think they're going to win the war, Yasser. Indeed.
And building up on that point is that I wanted to take the liberty to make a suggestion that I think because of the electioneering and preceding that, the genocide underway in Gaza since October 7th, the focus of MOATS, your other shows, your public discourse, your politics has been somewhat, monopolized by these issues. As you can know, there are quite a few very interesting developments that have taken place since then across the world. One in particular that I wish to highlight is the recent election of Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. This was a first in Mexico's history. The incumbent president, AMLO, because they have a one-term limit, 6 years, he was commanding the highest popularity polling numbers. And Claudia Sheinbaum has a very interesting profile. Your friend Rania Khalek interviewed her. I think I've traveled quite a few times to Mexico. I've shared your shows. There is a lot of appetite for, for your brand of politics, for your coverage, for your interviews. Likewise, in that region, Colombia now has a leftist president for the first time, to the best of my information. You haven't been to Cuba and Venezuela in a while. And on top of that, Pakistan is desperately waiting for your in-person visit. I guess you're very well aware of what's happening there. The military junta is effectively turning the country into a bizarre form of North Korea, with full support of its Western masters, neo-colonial masters, particularly Uncle Sam. And taking that to the Far East and Australia, I'm sure that region also has awaited your scrutiny that what is the Labour Party currently ruling, how they have persecuted Senator Fatma Payman of Afghan origin, and finally she has been made to resign, and she's being hounded now by the ruling party and its minions and the Murdoch press. So I guess to summarize, I'm taking the liberty of suggesting a world trip, a road show of MOATS as well as the Workers' Party, and bringing in to your fold, and sharing your message, learning on the ground and from those parties that are of interest, that have some commonalities, and covering those regions that haven't been covered in a while by yourself and your shows.
Well, no liberty at all in that. It is a set of splendid suggestions. If we had the resource, we would definitely do that physically, but we can certainly do it in terms of the show. We can broaden the number of theatres that we touch on. It's difficult to get away from a genocide. I know that you're not doubting that at all, but it is quite difficult to get away from it. It's difficult to get away from an election cycle of such significance as 2024. It's difficult to get away from Trump versus Biden, but we must try. And every one of the suggestions that you made there was a worthy one. And if I wasn't a father of 6 children with a need to earn a living now, I would certainly love that road trip. But watch this space, Yasser. We may very soon be able to accommodate 1 or 2 at least of your suggestions. I take my hat off to you for your kindness and your erudition. Live to Simon from Weaponized News. He used to be called Simon the Legend in Florida. Now he's got his own outfit, and only fools don't follow it. It's Simon from Weaponized News with tonight's developing news. Simon, go ahead.
Greetings to you, Mr. Galloway, and to your worldwide audience. Well, unfortunately, I'm fulfilling my role as telling you that everything is much, much worse than you have currently portrayed. We've just had a most extraordinary performance from Mr. Healy, the brand spanking new British Defence Minister, on a panel at the Nato Public Forum that people can watch after your show at natopublicforum.org. There was a separate channel for today and tomorrow. And to set the context here, he's obviously just returned from visiting President Zelensky in Ukraine, where he promised to actually formalize what you and I had been mocking Sunak and Shaps for. Healy has said they're going to put in writing the 100-year British alliance with Ukraine. He then went to Moldova with no parliamentary debate whatsoever and promised that Britain would provide for the defense of Moldova. He's now flown to Washington, D.C., where he's been sitting next to the bombastic lunatic former general in command of Europe by the name of Ben Hodges. And the things he said are quite profoundly shocking. So he said that within days, Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister, will be announcing that the Strategic Defence Review will be commenced. It will be completed at pace, and it will be on a large scale looking forward far into the future. He has agreed with Mr. Hodges, and this is a direct quote from the British Defence Minister, Putin is at war with all our countries now. In public, the British Defence Minister just said that less than 1 hour ago. He said that the United Kingdom defence, the direct quote once again, start at Ukraine. The United Kingdom defence starts at Ukraine. And he said that as a bipartisan issue, that he's proud of the actions of the previous British government in relation to Ukraine. This is the Labour Defence Minister. That's what he said in relation to the Conservative government. And he's announced that within 100 days, all of the pledges from Rishi Sunak in relation to military support for Ukraine will be filled ahead of schedule. And he said that Keir Starmer is issuing his personal guarantee that will be done within 100 days. He said that they've already last week done a stop check and sent everything that Britain could spare currently. We've seen that in the British media, the AS-90s and a load of 50 caliber machine gun ammunition. And he said that he can announce now that Britain is going to step up, look at the big picture and extend its assistance from military and financial to Ukraine to political, diplomatic and economic support. It's absolutely extraordinary. And he then went so far as to quote what was supposed to be a classified meeting, President Biden in the North Atlantic Council that he just walked from, saying that President Biden has just said that Russia is the number one threat to Europe. Now, to put this in context, and I appreciate we're running short on time, but this is, you're getting the world premiere on this, on your show right now. Nobody in the British media has covered this. This has happened in the last 60 minutes, sir. And now one needs to look at what's happening while this is going on in Washington, D.C. at the NATO meeting. We've had 7 countries visiting China and President Xi this week. Thailand, Belarus, Guinea-Bissau, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Bangladesh, and Hungary, all going to see China. Modi's just received the Russian equivalent of the Knighthood of the Garter, the Order of St. Andrew, of which there is no other higher Russian award, and it's only awarded for extraordinary services to the Russian Federation, the nation of which today is now hosting the BRICS Parliamentary Forum, where they're going to be doing another massive deal with Iran on the sidelines. So I hope that your audience will consider tuning in with my show on weaponizednews.com tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. New York time, where I'll be doing a full rundown of all the events both today and tomorrow, because they're clearly earth-shattering developments. And as I always say to you, sir, when these people are sitting in front of an audience of people they went to university and they're in their political parties and their clubs, even when they've been warned it's on record, it's incredible the things they say.
Yes, absolutely. Is that therefore 11:30 p.m. UK time tomorrow night?
Yes. Yes, Mr. Galloway.
Okay, you'd be foolish to miss it. Weaponized News, 11:30 p.m. UK time tomorrow night, to get the full significance of that extraordinary breaking news that Simon from Weaponized News has just brought us. Little Grant Shapps, or Grant Green, or Mrs. Green, or all of the various aliases that he used for his business over the years, who was the former defense minister, lost his parliamentary seat. I was really pleased that he lost his parliamentary seat until I realized that it meant that inky-fingered, six-stone weakling JohnHealy would feel so emasculated, if you get my drift, that he would have to go and declare World War III in New York on your behalf. It is truly, truly, madly, deeply insane. Bambala 7 says, it's hard to watch the game at the same time as MOATS. Turning off the game now. Thanks for that. Nicola Curtin says, I cannot watch football while there is genocide happening in the world. Well, I'll go to Miami for the Hannibal Directive, but only once I've asked my good wife, who now sits alongside me in the studio. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Bringing you tea as well. There you go. Yes.
Who could get a better wife than this?
I wanted to start with a picture that's been going around on the social media, which shows the headlines of The Guardian. First, from November 2023, and the one from a couple of days ago this year. The first one says the IDF says it has entered Gaza's Al-Shifa's hospital in targeted operation against Hamas. And the one from 8th July, 2 days ago, says no words for this. Horror over Russian bombing of Kiev's Children's Hospital.
Incredible.
I mean,
it's incredible.
It's incredible. There's nothing to be added.
It's not credible. There's nothing to be added. it is not just the case that the blood of Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims is infinitely of less value to them than the blood of others. Even the others who are not us, but if they're Ukrainians, not only are they white, blue-eyed, fair-haired people, but they're right up against the Russian bear. And that's what causes this derangement. This is, you know, they talk about Trump derangement syndrome. This is Russian derangement syndrome that they are suffering from. What else we got?
Exactly, and we still haven't figured out why, because obviously Soviet Union has collapsed, and therefore NATO should have collapsed with it. And thus we ask the question, will NATO allow a Ukraine peace deal? Across all platforms, it's towards 95%.
90% say no.
No, people have got no faith at all. At least not until...
and that's a 30,000 number poll, by the way.
Yeah,
it's not a small poll.
No, it's a high
midweek.
poll. At least whilst Biden is in office, says Darren Levy. Once Trump is in, they won't like it, but once he's in November, he can see him using his influence as president to force NATO to accept the deal. We all hope.
He might let us down, but I feel that. On the principle that even a stop clock is right twice a day.
Correct.
On Ukraine, I think Trump will do what he said. He'll stop the war. And before he even takes office.
Yeah. Sherry says that NATO is sitting on the golden egg, so why would they go for peace? And this is what a lot of people are saying. People can see right through it. Jewel says, the money laundering and theft of the taxpayers' money will not stop. We all know how it works. You know, give aid, give money through to the charity, and then goes back via arms sales. People can see through all of this. This is basically the gist of it. Bringing it closer to home, Sean Babington says, it's interesting how Mr. Galloway predicted that Starmer would lead us to war within 6 months, and yet within 6 days this new government is already
Didn't take 6 days, yeah.
It's
well, I know these people. I know how inadequate they are and how they need to strut around the world like this, essentially threatening people with somebody else's army.
Yeah.
Just like Mussolini used to preen on that balcony. He really was saying, if you don't succumb to us, we'll set Hitler on you.
Well, speaking
and
of
that's what little Healy is doing.
Well, speaking of Hitler, Gonzalo makes the point that obviously on the 75th anniversary of NATO, they thanked their allies for fighting against Russia, but it was Russia that defeated the Nazis in Europe.
Yeah.
Very quickly, because Orion I had a great laugh hearing Orion calling in from the US.
You've never heard of Charles Atlas, have you? Charles Atlas was a big He-Man bodybuilder. And his ad used to be a before and after of a 6-stone weakling and Charles now. And that was the advertising blurb. I was a 6-stone weakling until I discovered Charles Atlas's bodybuilding magazine. That's what, in my mind, that was Orion. But it turns out Orion is 6 foot tall.
Yeah,
himself.
He's not small. He's just standing up.
He's probably a He-Man.
But he's standing up for Sunak in
For the little guy.
all the way from
the little guy, Rishi Sunak. Well, the little guy.
Well, here I have someone in the UK, in Scotland, defending someone in the US. He says, because remember last week we had a poll about Joe Biden having a dementia.
Yeah.
He says, I'm a big fan of MOATS and GG, and there is no one in politics anywhere like him. But I am extremely upset every time GG wrongly diagnoses Joe Biden with dementia. He may be old, a bit forgetful, and his stutter syndrome, but he's nowhere near senile dementia.
Actually, a specialist in the field said that he's got Parkinson's. He said, I could diagnose it across an airport departure hall.
Yeah.
It's that obvious to me. And this man was a professor in that field. The idea that he's only got a stutter, I mean, frankly, you've drunk the Kool-Aid, my friend.
Well, James in 5 is convinced that if you would spend 1 hour with a person with real dementia, you would stop.
Yeah, but that person with real dementia doesn't have his finger on the world's biggest nuclear arsenal. I know what you're saying, sir. People who've really got advanced dementia are a sorry sight to see and have to deal with. I get that. But Joe Biden's the president of the United States, for God's sake. We can't let, political correctness preclude us from naming it what it is. It is senility in the world's most powerful and dangerous man. Sorry.
No. You move on, because there are other women who want to have a word with you.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
My goodness. There'll never be another woman for me, honey. I won't take you for chips, because we're already home. But I'll watch the England game with you. Anna in Miami is our final call of the night. Anna, welcome.
Hello, George. Hi, Gayatri. Hey, George, I wanted to share with you what I believe is a logical conclusion regarding the whole Hannibal doctrine, Hannibal directive that was supposedly issued October 7th. Okay, bear with me, because it's going to sound maybe a little harsh, but I believe that if the Hannibal directive, which is supposed to be a military command to keep soldiers from becoming hostages, okay, if that's what the Hannibal directive is, and that's what it is, yet the IDF were given orders to, quote, Haaretz, shoot at every vehicle on the road, including civilians, then, George, doesn't it follow, okay, I'm trying to be logical, doesn't it follow that what happened on October 7th wasn't really the Hannibal directive? No, sir. What I think happened, it was a mass casualty event, but it was a massacre of Israelis by the Israeli Defense Forces. In other words, what has been dubbed Operation Jericho Wall, I mean, this operation was set to go live at any time, and they just went live October 7th. Operation Jericho Wall, a joint CIA-Mossad black op, has two purposes. It's a great excuse to finally genocide our poor Palestinian brothers and sisters, for God's sake.
Well, look, it's not that it sounds harsh. It's not that it sounds harsh that requires me to rebut it. It's that it is entirely condescending towards the Palestinian people, that they have no agency in this matter. I'm willing to believe that the removal of the 3 Israeli brigades from the Gaza border and their transfer to the West Bank is a deeply suspicious act. I'm willing to believe that the Zionist movement has committed many false flag operations from Baghdad in the 1950s and many other places. You get people convicted all the time of defacing Jewish property with swastikas that turn out to be bogus, turn out to have been politically motivated hoaxes. Happens all the time. So I'm not saying that Israel would not or could not do any such thing. But that would require the Palestinian resistance factions, hundreds of them, hundreds of fighters who left the concentration camp that day, to have been a part of a black op, CIA, Mossad black op. And I won't believe that, don't believe that, can't believe that. On the contrary, the only surprising thing about October 7th is that it doesn't happen every October 7th or every 6 weeks. After all, when the Jewish people in the ghetto in Warsaw, dying singly of typhus and hunger and individual murders, decided that it was better to die on their feet than to stay on their knees in a ghetto and wait for their inevitable death. The only surprising thing about the resistance operation on October 7th is that it doesn't happen more often, because I'll tell you, and I'm sure you are the same, if somebody put me in a concentration camp and kept me there for all of my grandfather's life, all of my father's life, and all of my own to-date life, and foreseeably the lifetime of all of my children, would I try to break out of a concentration camp? And if I did, and I found one of the guards that had kept my grandfather until my children in a concentration camp, would I harm them? Would I harm them? It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. God willing, I'll be back on Sunday with the mothership, the mother of all talk shows. Now, I want to give you this task. I want each of you to bring one other viewer, just one other viewer on Sunday for MOATS. Let's see the impact we can make. Promise me? Okay, good night.